Well, welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. And yet again, we are going to focus on the issue of Bill C-11. I don't want your eyes to glaze over because I think it's really important that we take a careful look at what's at stake here. It is easy to say that this bill is about freedom of speech, but it is more importantly about the freedom to create Canadian content, both for domestic audiences and for foreign audiences. It's about how much you want the government involved in the decision about what you can watch and listen to on the internet. And I think it's about fairness, about whether or not we're going to treat small creators, people who are making videos and movies and all kinds of productions, but aren't the big players, and how they are impacted by this. So we thought this, because this young man, I'm going to put it that way, JJ McCullough, has testified on this issue more than once in front of the House of Commons and again in front of the Senate. So JJ is a YouTube personality. I think that's a fair description. A cultural commentator based in Vancouver in British Columbia. He writes a weekly column for the Washington Post about Canadian politics, but aimed at an international audience, trying to explain what goes on in our head. And he's the author of the Canadian Guide website, and he's commented on many political issues on television over the years. But this is the important thing. His YouTube channel has 850,000 subscribers. JJ, thank you. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Help us get through this this situation. So this bill C-11 wants the CRTC to regulate what we can see on the internet by pushing forward some content, making it more, to use the word, discoverable, findable by Canadians. And that implies that other content won't be so findable, because if something goes up, something else goes down. That's one of the concerns. What's at the heart of this for you?
No, I think that you described it accurately when you sort of said that this is about deciding what Canadians can watch online, and not only what Canadians can watch, but what in government's mind Canadians should be watching. And I think that's very important, that we understand kind of the ideological motivation of the bill itself, as much as the text of the written bill. The Minister of Heritage has said explicitly that he believes that there is a threat to, quote, Canadian cultural sovereignty, which, from what I understand, is this idea that Canadians are sort of failing as a people in some sort of deep moral kind of national way if we are not consuming enough good Canadian content. And what is good Canadian content? Well, that is a big question mark, but the government has concluded that we're not doing enough of it. And so what this means is that a good Canadian, is one who is watching a certain quota of Canadian content. And if Canadians are not inclined to do that on their own accord, well, then government and through the CRTC should step in and should affect the internet experience that we all enjoy when we load up a website like YouTube or TikTok or Netflix or Disney Plus or whatever. Government should have some sort of guiding hand in steering audiences towards certain types of content that they believe would be in the national patriotic interest in order to help the cultural sovereignty of the country, and I guess improve sort of the cultural, integrity of this nation in some way. And what this means is that there are a lot of Canadian YouTubers, such as myself, who are worried that our content going forward won't necessarily pass the muster, that our content might not be in some way Canadian enough to be promoted in this new kind of algorithm that the government is going to mandate platforms like YouTube use going forward. So going forward, when you type in, you go to search for something, or you just load up the main page of YouTube and you sort of see the recommendations that appear in your feed, or even your subscription tab, that all of this could be modified in some way to steer users towards specific types of content that the government believes they should be watching, And even if you are a Canadian content creator like myself, you can't necessarily take it for granted that just because you're from Canada and making Canadian content, that will be good enough. The CRTC will come up with some sort of metric for what good Canadian content is, and you'll rise and fall based on your ability to conform with those standards.
That's one of the issues I think we all have, which is, what is Canadian content? I mean, does it, you're a Canadian, as far as I know. You
Yes.
talk about issues that impact Canada. And I was just watching one the other night that you had done explaining our relationship to the monarchy. Now, you weren't as big a fan of the Queen as some are, but then again, we've got political leaders that aren't fans of the Queen either. So you're worried then that they may decide that they don't like your take on a particular issue, and therefore you won't be the right kind of Canadian content.
That is a concern, definitely. You sort of wonder about the the messages, the content, the argument that you're making, if those are sort of deemed to be in sort of the national interest or not. But it can get even more kind of complicated than that. And Professor Michael Geist has done a lot of very good sort of discussions about this, where he says that even right now, under the current CRTC Canadian regulatory regime that determines the Canadianness, this is sort of a bizarre, I think, somewhat even Orwellian term, the idea that you can become certifiably Canadian in the eyes of the CRTC. But when you pass the Canadian certification, criteria as it relates to television and radio, it is often sort of deeply counterintuitive, and it often relies not even on necessarily identifiably Canadian themes, but questions of like, how many Canadian producers or editors were involved? Was there a Canadian script writer? And, all this kind of stuff. It's very much sort of going down the sort of the production line. And, there are a lot of Canadian YouTubers, frankly, who outsource some degree of their editing to overseas, to people in the US. They might rely on, foreigners to help them with the script writing or with the visual effects, with the sound design and this kind of stuff. So like all of that becomes a concern as well. If you have like any foreigners involved in the production of your videos, is that suddenly going to count as demerit points against your Canadianness? So that's a very valid concern, in addition to the sort of the content type of things as well. And it's worth remembering that even though a lot of this is ultimately going to be decided by the CRTC, Bill C-11 does have kind of an ideological laundry list of certain things that they want good Canadian content to include, stuff that we might agree sort of in the abstract matters, stuff like, Indigenous affairs and helping LGBT people and people of color and, the French, English kind of stuff like that. I mean, those are all worthy things that I think we can agree like matter in some sort of abstract sort of moral sense. But a lot of Canadian content creators aren't necessarily interested in making their content serve a certain political agenda. And so say if you're a YouTuber who just makes like cooking tutorial videos, it's legitimate to worry that because their content isn't sort of adhering or meeting any of those kind of ideological standards, is their content in turn going to be suppressed by this new algorithm that the CRTC will have to introduce.
Going back to C-10 and when Stephen Guilbeault was the minister, he actually said, and he probably didn't mean to say it, and he never said it a second time because I think somebody jumped on him, but it was he went so far as to say, we want to make sure that you're not being critical of what we're doing, because we're the government of Canada. I'm paraphrasing his words, but that was what he said. So that does give people a little pause about, as you say, what is the criteria actually about? What's the motivation behind this bill?
Yes. And it's like people can sometimes say, oh, you're being paranoid and all of this kind of thing. Criticisms that I've obviously dealt with a lot. But the question is like, you should take the government at its word, right? And you should sort of think like, well, what would be failure in the eyes of the government, right? What would this bill look like if it was not doing what it promised to do? And that's a worthy sort of metric to sort of keep in mind.
Yeah.
And the government, because at some point, obviously, the government is going to have to come to its shareholders and, the special interests that I believe are actually dictating this bill. Yeah. And they're going to have to come to them and say, look at all of, the quote unquote good things that this bill did. And I think that in order to make that case, the government is going to have to prove that Bill C-11 was in fact elevating the good types of content, was in fact promoting the certain messages and sort of ideological objectives that they have stated clearly is one of the missions of this bill. So I think we should take them very seriously when they say what they want to do. It's the old saying, when people tell you what they believe them.
Yeah, believe them. Yeah. Now, I mean, a lot of this is about money and the vested interests that already get a lot of money from the system, whether it's directly from the government or through media funds, and they don't want that at all jeopardized. But there's no indication that under this new bill, people like you would be able to access the Canadian media funds for your creation. Or do you think there's an opportunity for you to do that?
I mean, I don't think that has ever really been the objective of the Canadian Media Fund, if I can be kind of blunt about it, right? Like I'm successful, right? Like in YouTube, right? Like I make a decent living being a successful YouTuber. The Canadian Media Fund, I think, has always existed more to subsidize people who are sort of failing in the market economy of culture and entertainment, right? And so in that sort of sense, like this is what I mean when I say that, and this is sort of like a line that I said in my testimony at the House of Commons, is that this is something that no sort of creator has asked for. And when I talk to people in the online content creation community, they all sort of feel like this came completely out of left field because we're doing fine. Like the status quo works for us. And I don't mean that, it's been kind of like easy street coasting. It works fine for us because we have worked hard to be successful in this field. We've worked hard to create content that audiences, both in Canada and internationally, are interested in watching. And I think that some people who are not able to succeed in this bold new world, be they, I think, frankly, a lot in sort of the traditional media that's kind of falling behind, there's kind of a sense that this is sort of fundamentally unjust. And then government thus has to sort of raise taxes and fees on the successful in order to sort of subsidize the unsuccessful. So, yeah, like the financial side of stuff isn't even like an attractive draw to me at all, because I don't think it exists to benefit people like myself.
Why don't we just back up a bit here? So you've got 850,000 subscribers. People pay to subscribe to watch your videos.
No, not exactly. It's people don't pay at all. In fact, it's all based on advertising, right? So every time you watch a YouTube video, unless you have YouTube Premium, there will often be advertisements, interrupting the video before, after, pop-ups, and so forth. And so, I get a cut of that advertising. YouTube takes most of it, but I get a cut. And, because my videos are viewed by, hundreds of thousands of people, it does add up. And then actually, but then there's like other YouTubers as well who have slightly different revenue models.
And if I hit the skip ad button, which you can do on your television and you can do online, that doesn't impact you.
I'm not 100% sure. I don't think it does, because, the advertisers are buying exposure. It's just like how, if you're watching television and you mute the ad, it doesn't.
Or I get up and go and get, a cup of coffee during the so that system's roughly the same. So that's how you make a living. And with that many subscribers, people who tune in, you can make a decent income. You're not asking for any subsidy. You're not asking for a bigger chunk of the pie.
Yeah, precisely. Like it's a business model that is entirely sustainable. And as I've said many times before, like I have 850,000 subscribers. That might sound like a lot, but like I'm not even in the top 300 most successful.
I read that, like you're 414th in the Canadian world.
It's astonishing. There have been this is what I mean. Like this is just such a vibrant, thriving sector of the Canadian cultural entertainment industry. It's one that I think a lot of people in government, frankly, have completely missed, are completely oblivious to, and thus are, throwing this huge monkey wrench into a well-functioning machine just because I think that they've been persuaded by sort of special interests in the old media who are not keeping up with the times and are frankly a little bit jealous and resentful, and they're trying to bring us down. And that's why I think that a lot of people in my sort of subculture view this bill as being somewhat hostile in its motivation.
It is, one does get that sense. I mean, yes, they want the ideology, they want some control over the messaging. They want to appease certain communities that support them. I mean, most governments do that in one way or another, usually not quite so obviously. But it might also just have a large component of what you just say, which is they don't get your world.
Yeah, I think that they don't. I think that I'm 38 years old. I appreciated you calling me a young man, but I kind of feel like I'm actually on the older end of this spectrum
of this world. Yeah,
doing what I do, right? Like it is a lot of younger people in their 20s, frankly, who are able to sort of thrive in this world. And I sometimes even feel like there's a lot of it that even me at 38 like don't completely understand. So I guess on some level it's not entirely unforgivable that politicians in their 50s, 60s, 70s are kind of oblivious to what's going on here. But I mean, to me, that should have shown that the government, before it even contemplated Bill C-10, let alone Bill C-11, should have done a lot more consulting with people like me and people within my community, rather than just trying, just listening to, I guess, some special interests and then trying to impose this kind of blunt solution about a realm of the Canadian economy that they just clearly do not understand at all.
We all use the phrase, because it's in the bill, user-generated content. That's what you do. You use the YouTube system and you generate content for it. Is that kind of where the word comes from?
Yeah, although it's like this again gets to kind of just some of the ignorance of the whole debate, because I've heard like even ministers and stuff talk about this. There's this kind of sense that like, well, there's like user generated content, which is like, some person uploading a silly cat video. And it's like, obviously we won't go for that because that's like frivolous, pointless content, and who cares, right? But it's like the serious content, the revenue generating content that matters. And the bill says that explicitly in section 4. The content that we're interested in is revenue generating content. But the thing is that even the dopiest cat video could generate revenue if it's successful enough, right? Everybody who uses YouTube, like anybody who goes in to log into YouTube, can upload a video to YouTube. Whether that's me, JJ, out in Vancouver, whether that's my aunt uploading a cat video, and whether that's, some guy working at the CBC's social media department. He then becomes the user who is uploading the user-generated content, but the user that's generating the content could be the CBC, it could be CTV, it could be some huge production studio. We are all users of just different scale. We're all generating content. We're all uploading it. And, as a result, we kind of all fall under this rubric, right? And it's especially those who are generating revenue, who are doing it as a living, who have their business model to create content, upload it onto YouTube. We are explicitly under the jurisdiction of this legislation. And as much as people like are using these kind of like references to a kind of, kind of folk wisdom about like that, well, there's like dopey content on the internet and then there's serious content on the
cat video is always the reference. But this is one of the key questions, because if you're generating revenue, it may not be coming into your hands. I can put this podcast out, or somebody could just pop a video up on TikTok or YouTube or whatever it is. And then if it's getting thousands, millions of plays, somebody's making money, like TikTok, like YouTube, but not the person that uploaded this meaningful plea about understanding how the Canadian political system works, or the cat video, right? I mean, someone may just have been passionate and uploaded their thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of it's a little complicated, because once your channel achieves a certain level of success. Somebody was asking me about this the other day, and I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like if you get 1,000 subscribers, you can start monetizing on YouTube. And then, you start getting a sort of share of the revenue. But yeah, I mean, it's possible, like the extreme small channels that have like, like 3 subscribers, and they might just be using YouTube to upload, birthday party videos of their grandchildren or something, right? Yeah, that stuff, I suppose you could say, will not fall under the jurisdiction of Bill C-11. Although even then,
they're not explicitly excluded either, because somebody's generating content or generating revenue.
Yeah, and what you said earlier at the top was relevant as well, because even if it's not explicitly being regulated, when things are being promoted, that can't help but, suppress other forms of content, right? So it's
Yeah.
like there will always be winners and losers in this sense. And I think that, yeah, it's important to realize that even the content that's not generating revenue, even the content that's sort of like not at my level, will still be impacted because it will have to exist in a modified ecosystem that treats things other than audience interest as being the deciding factor of what gets shown and what doesn't.
Because that's one of the counter arguments that we hear when we have witnesses on this bill, which is, but the platforms already do this. They already push content that may have some financial benefit for them, and they not suppress, but they, push other stuff down because they want you to look at certain things, and they are judging what you might want to look at based on your history. They're looking at that. They're watching what you click on, right? And so they give you more of that. So there is already a push down, suppress system in the algorithms that exist.
Yeah, and that's true. But I mean, like YouTube, TikTok, whatever, these are private companies that have a right, I think, to determine their own algorithms, right? I don't think that jealous government has to intervene. I just don't think it's the role of the state to be making these sorts of decisions, especially for something like, in the realm of entertainment, where I think people have a right to, curate their own entertainment experiences. I mean, it just seems like a very poor argument to argue that because a private company is running its business in a certain way, that means government has an equal right to run that private business in its certain way. It's a non sequitur.
They could run its own business that way, government.
Yeah, precisely.
but not somebody else's business. The other question that comes up, and you do have an international audience. People are interested in you and what you talk about, and I don't know, they may like your hair. Who knows why it is that people, watch what they watch. But this also, when you have a piece of domestic legislation that says we're going to control the internet and the content on it and decide what gets pushed up and what gets pushed down, that's going to have implications for you, not just in Canada, where they say they're interested in making sure that Canadians see Canadian content. And I think they mean specialty content, but that's going to then impact what the foreign audiences see as well.
Yes, no, absolutely. Because like sort of the premise of the bill seems to be that Canadian content should exist primarily for the benefit of Canadian audiences, and that Canada, and this again, the argument of like cultural sovereignty sort of presupposes that there sort of needs to be like a wall around Canada that not only prevents foreign things from getting in, but also Canadian things from getting out. And that it sort of has to be this kind of like perfect little hermetically sealed bubble in order to protect the integrity. And so, yes, that is a very legitimate concern as well, that if YouTube and platforms like it are kind of forced by law to kind of tailor or promote Canadian content to Canadian audiences, what does this mean for our ability to be promoted to international audiences? Will that be sort of like part of the cost of being a Canadian content creator, is that you have to resign yourself to like, yeah, maybe my stuff will be pushed more to Canadian audiences, but it will be pushed less to foreign audiences because YouTube will feel much less obligation to help promote content to an international audience because they're not legally required to do so. Yeah. They are legally required to push it domestically. But as we know, Canada's great as Canada may be, it doesn't have that many people. I don't know any Canadian content creator who makes their living entirely based on Canadian appeal. Even me, who makes videos explicitly about all these like very esoteric Canadian things, my primary audience is international people who are interested in learning about Canada. And I would hate to give that up.
Well, and this has been the history of Canada. I mean, we have exported more comedians and actors and singers than anybody I can think of. And yet we want to claim, we want to talk about the big bad Americans and why we need to protect our own cultural identity and Canadian sovereignty. But then we brag when, Schitt's Creek is purchased by an American network, or Michael J. Fox is successful, or Justin Bieber. We have this kind of split personality here about whether we want to play on a global stage.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think those are good examples, because I think that YouTube has been a case study that is very much in line with the proud tradition of Canadians sort of punching above their weight,
Mhm.
culturally speaking, right? Like many of the top YouTubers have even been Canadians as it exists now. In the unregulated state, Canadians have been some of the biggest superstars in the world in the realm of online content. So again, like this is just such a solution in search of a problem. There doesn't seem to be like any clear like barriers that are preventing Canadians from being successful, because Canadians are wonderfully talented, artistic, imaginative people that have always had a real knack, I think, for entertaining,
Yeah.
as we did in the past, and as I think we're doing in the present.
I guess the other concern is too, is if Canada does this, and we've seen some other countries flirt with the idea, it's usually been pushed back. But if everybody becomes their own little domestic bubble and passes the equivalent of Bill C-11 in France and Australia and wherever else it might be, then it again restricts your ability to reach a larger audience from that, because they'll be doing the same thing. They'll be protecting, German content or protecting Italian content.
Yes, yes, and this is what my colleague Justin Tomchuk said at the Senate testimony. Another successful Canadian YouTuber, right? Like we're kind of moving away, and Canada, I think, despite all of Canada's sort of multicultural sort of pretensions, is leading the charge in a very negative direction, away
Mhm.
from sort of globalized international internet and towards a kind of narrow, cloistered, isolated, nationalistic YouTube or internet, in which sort of different countries have different online experiences depending on where you are. If you're using Italian YouTube, are you only going to see,
Right.
videos that the Italian government has dictated are in the national interest, and thus people are walled off from sort of experiencing all of sort of the diversity that the world has to offer. But the even more sort of, I think, nefarious kind of angle to this, or the way to interpret it, is when we think of like authoritarian governments,
Right.
be it Russia or China or Hungary or places like that, who can now sort of say, well, Canada does it. Canada says
Right.
they have a right to protect their cultural sovereignty from the wicked foreigners and their corrosive, foreign
Ideas.
culture. Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like, what right will we ever have to, point the finger at Iran or whatever countries that have viewed the internet with great suspicion, precisely because the infiltration of foreign ideas is seen as a threat to the regime? What right will we have to judge these kinds of nations if we are doing the same thing using very similar rhetoric? I mean, obviously we're
Right.
not an authoritarian society, but I think that there's aspects when you use language like cultural sovereignty and needing to protect from the foreigners, that does have a sort of authoritarian tone to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not any better just because you think your government is the best, and that you're nice, and that you're good, and that therefore your ideas are nice and good, and so it's fine. Because even in this country, when a different government is elected, people may not want the same powers granted to those people. Be careful what you wish for, government of the day, because you won't always be government of the day.
Yeah, no, that is such a classic and I think important argument to be made whenever we are thinking about granting government new powers. And I
Mhm.
think that that's very clearly what this bill fundamentally is about. And whenever I'm talking about it with people, whenever I'm trying to describe it in a simplistic way, the best way I think to describe it is that this is government giving itself new powers. In the 1990s, the Chrétien government explicitly chose not to give the CRTC power over the internet. And when you read the memos justifying that decision, I think they're very forward thinking. They sort of said, like, we understand the internet is this kind of vibrant, diverse kind of place. It's being led by independent creators. It's very entrepreneurial, and government should respect that, and government should sort of take a step back. And now we're walking in the complete opposite direction, where government is now grabbing power in order to regulate the internet like it never has before, in order to control the user experience of the internet like we have never experienced before. So it's a very regressive move, and it is a power grab by a government that feels a right to assert more control over something as, I think, intimate and personal as what you choose to watch and enjoy in your own time on the internet.
Yeah, it is that, keep it out of the bedrooms and the living rooms of the nation, right? Or the
Yeah.
computer screens of the nation. You want to make those choices yourself. We have rules to deal with and laws to deal with content that may be really offensive or hateful. And we have to, we do need some rules around that. But this may be the step too far. You said I think it was in the Senate hearings that you're realistic enough, knowing the Canadian political process now, that government isn't going to wake up one morning and say, "Oh gosh, we just figured out what you guys were talking about. You're right. This is really, really bad, and
Yes.
we're going to withdraw this bill." And so that's not going to happen. So you're looking for some form of compromise that allows you to continue to create, earn a living, be an entrepreneur, have an audience, share your ideas. What compromise would allow that?
So as I said in the Senate, I think that the compromise would probably be to just lean into the sort of financial aspects of the bill a little bit more, what we discussed earlier. I think that, if the Canadian Creator Fund, if websites like YouTube and other such sites are taxed more heavily, are required to make greater contributions to funds like this, if they're required to, if government is sort of like increasing its subsidy budget to help, creators and legacy media people that are seen to be struggling in the internet age, I think that is a compromise that I think a lot of creators could live with. I mean, obviously, government can't just, grab money without consequence. If you raise taxes and raise fees, even on a giant corporation like YouTube, which is, run by Google, even if you do that, they will pass those costs along to both the users and the creators, right? That might result in me getting a smaller share of the revenue. They might feel the need to take more of a share of the ad revenue than they currently do, just to make up for the cost that they'll now be paying into the government.
And charge more to watch you.
And charge more to watch, right? Like that there's, or there could just be more ads, which will make the YouTube experience more obnoxious, right? So like there's obviously trade-offs to be made, but I do think that like most creators and most Canadian audiences would be willing, I think, to make the financial sacrifice if it meant that the integrity of the content and the watching experience was preserved. So that would be kind of my sense, is like not to be sort of too crass about this, but it's like, how many more zeros do we need to write on the check to kind of make the go away?
And you get the sense from the big platforms that they understand that governments get to do what governments get to do. You can disagree with them, and every 4 years you get to have a vote on that, but they have to go along. I guess the downside of that is, and we've heard some testimony on this as well, is that then people like you and entities like YouTube just have bases in other countries where they can circumvent these laws that are going to restrict their business model and what they do and your creativity.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And actually, that's sort of something that some Canadians have expressed, concern to me personally about. It's like, well, is YouTube just at some point going to like withdraw from Canada? Like, is Canada, I mean, this is, this is a bigger topic, I think, when it comes to the Canadian economy in general. Are we doing what is necessary to make Canada an attractive place to do business, an attractive place to invest in? Or are we just creating all of these barriers and obstacles where like doing business in Canada just seems like a big logistical headache, a nightmare, that we're just making all of these, rules in the name of just like esoteric Canadian obsessions that are just very unattractive? And I think that that's a big concern as well. And so, yeah, I've had lots of Canadian content creators to me say this as well, which is like, should I move to the US? Should I move to some other country? Like, will my life as a content creator, is the only way I can preserve a status quo that's working for me to just leave the country altogether? To me, that seems a little melodramatic, but at the same time, like, government has to be sensitive to like, this is the sort of reaction that it's eliciting from this kind of legislation.
And then that would move you down on the perfect Canadian content Richter scale as well, because then if you lived in Seattle instead of, Vancouver, then you wouldn't even have that check mark, but you would then, people could still watch you in Canada, but you'd be going for a more global audience.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, well, even although we also don't know for sure if maybe people would be watching me in Canada. Maybe if I moved to
Right.
America, I would suddenly become a foreigner and then have to be
No,
blocked.
that's what I mean. Yeah, you would lose whatever check, whatever box that, your residency checks
Yeah,
if that changes. But for the YouTubes, it's a different question. They can run their businesses anywhere.
yeah. No, it's true. And I mean, funny thing as well that a lot of people have brought up too is the phenomenon of the sort of the VPNs, if you're familiar with this, like the when you're on the internet, the computer sort of generates a code that tells you where you're from, right? And that you can buy VPN blockers that kind of disguise where you're logging onto the internet. And like these are sort of like technologies that are like popular in like authoritarian societies where you have to like escape government.
Well,
but a lot of people
look at China. I mean, we've watched that happen with their own domestic internet, right?
Yes. And so you kind of like wonder, is that like the future of Canada? Are we going to have like these kind of VPN blockers become this really mainstream thing because people are like covertly trying to like use a liberated internet outside of the government controlled internet? Like this is not my vision of like a free society.
Because then you go underground is what happens.
Precisely. Underground. Like, do we want to think about Canada as a country with like an underground resistance internet?
Yeah. Woo. So you used a good analogy at one point that while government says, no, we don't really want to regulate this. We just, we want not the users, we're not restricting free speech or creativity. But I think you compared it to a bookstore that you say, okay, books are fine, but we're going to decide what books can be in the store and what books you can put in the window to entice people to come into your store.
Yes, no.
If I got the analogy right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. No, because it's true. I mean, like, because the way that the government has traditionally spun it is that they say this is not a bill about content, it's a bill about platforms. But like as you said, like that analogy works because you're not regulating books per se, you're regulating the way in which they're distributed, the time, place, and manner in which they are sold. It's the same with like an even sort of like less kind of abstract analogy could just be like if we just think of television, right? Like you and I, we could film a TV show in our living room right now. That doesn't mean anything, right? Because we still have to work with the television networks that are in turn regulated by the CRTC. So like content is meaningless without a platform to which to distribute it. And, we live in an era in which you do, for good or ill, if you want to distribute videos or any other sort of content on the internet, you have to work with some sort of online platform to do so. And so the moment you start regulating platforms, you are ipso facto regulating the content that is shown or not shown on them.
Well, and nobody's going to go and write a book if nobody can buy it. Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. That's kind of the problem. You if you've written a genius book, then you want people to read it and see it and understand it. So what's your plan? Do you just can carry on and see how this plays out? Is this something you see doing for your lifetime? Is this a phase in your life? Like, where are you at when you look at what the world might become?
I mean, it might prove a phase. I've had a number of different jobs. You mentioned some of them at the beginning of the show. I have worked in conventional media. I've done a lot of writing. I still do writing. I have a whole sort of like art career on my side as well that I like to do. And I'm approaching my 40s, and I think that you do start to sort of like think about where you want your career to go as you enter a new phase of life, middle age, and all this kind of stuff. So I don't know if I'm going to be a YouTuber forever. Definitely stuff like this does factor into the decisions that you make about your future kind of going forward. But certainly like in the short term, at least, I'm going to continue to fight this as long as I can. And the sort of the kind of grim thing about it, though, as well, is that even once it passes the parliament, it then goes to the CRTC. And, so many of these executive agencies are sort of becoming like pseudo legislatures themselves, right? Because the CRTC has votes and hearings and witnesses and all this kind of stuff. So
and they write regulations. Yeah,
they do write regulations, right? And regulations that are going to be a lot more specific than even Bill C-11 itself, because Bill C-11 is kind of like, as I said, it's the bill that grants the new powers. It's the bill that sort of lines out the aspirational goals, but the CRTC has to do the nitty gritty of actually coming up with the dictates that YouTube and other platforms will actually have to follow in practice. So I'm going to obviously be watching all of that very closely. And then who knows how long that will take and how long that process will be. And then at some point, the regulations will be very clear. And then I'll have to look at them and with sort of clear eyes say, am I interested in dancing to this tune? Can I make my content conform with it? Or does it seem so unattractive and so difficult that, you know, government is kind of giving me maybe a little bit of a push to get into a new line of work? I don't know. We'll have to see. But
you're also fighting this battle for the next generation of JJs that are already out there, like they're there.
That's true, right? And it's like, you know, there's so many young people, you know, I've given talks at schools and stuff, and parents are sometimes, they come to me like very worried, and they're like, oh, my kid says he wants to be a YouTuber when he grows up. Like, oh, I don't know about that. And it's like,
be a doctor.
Well, it's like, it's not, I think in some ways, like aspiring to be a YouTuber when you grow up is a much more achievable dream than I think like aspiring to play in the NHL or aspiring to be a Hollywood actor, right?
Because you can be a rock star. Yeah,
because you can do it from your living room, and you know, it's the barriers to entry are a lot lower. It's much more sort of judged on, you know, just the content, less so the kind of the razzle dazzle and so forth. But on the other hand, like, you're absolutely right. Like, I'm saying that as someone who has risen through the ranks in an unregulated climate. And I would like to see the next generation have the same opportunities I did. But, you know, that might not be the case. A young kid growing up today, you know, who might look up to somebody like me or some other YouTuber as like a model of a kind of life and career that they might want for themselves, that might not be open for them. It might just be a much more difficult, much more bureaucratic, much more regulated and sort of confusing and unpleasant experience to be a professional YouTuber in Canada going forward. So you're right. Like, I am doing this in part, not just nakedly out of my own self-interest, but because I want what has been a very good and very enjoyable lifestyle and career for myself to be accessible to people younger than me.
Well, and for everybody to understand, this is not a zero-sum game, right? That legacy media is not going to survive unless they make the right business decisions. They're not going to survive if somebody puts you out of business.
Mm-hmm. No, precisely. It's and I think that there has been this kind of, I don't know, like kind of jealous, sort of petty attitude with the idea that like we're getting away with something, and then that's sort of like it's government's job to then, you know, pull us down. Whereas I said at the Senate as well, I mean, I think this is a little pie in the sky, just knowing how politics works. But I do think that like if legacy media is complaining that they are sort of struggling under a burden of regulation that new media doesn't have to play by, then I think that might be an opportunity to re-examine the regulatory burden on legacy media. You know, maybe just start liberating everyone rather than trying to like share the burden more broadly.
Yeah, and they could make that case.
Yeah.
For it. Really interesting conversation. Thank you for doing this, because not everybody tunes into the House of Commons and Senate committee hearings, as fascinating as they are. So I'm really glad that you walked us through this.
Oh, no, thank you so much. You asked some really insightful and important questions. And I've done a lot of talks about this, but I can say with honesty that I think this was one of the better ones.
Well, good. Let's hope we're doing some basic education. That's great. That'll make us good Canadians. Okay.
Yes.
Good Canadian content right here. JJ McCullough, YouTube personality, but as you can hear and see, very, very interested in the future of his country and the future of the business of which we were all a part in some way or another. So we'll see you again, I'm sure, when we're dealing with the next incarnation of this bill.
Stay tuned for the CRTC hearings. But thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It was great.
Thanks a lot. That's it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you soon.